This is chapter 3 on federalism. Let's get started with the questions. The first question is pick a public policy and show how it relates to federalism. Well, what I did was I picked the question of education, or the area of policy known as education, educational policy. And what I did was I broke it down into federal, state, and local and try to figure out what the functions of each are. What's the role or contribution of the federal government to education? What's the role or contribution of the state, and then local government? Well, when you start out and you look at this diagram here, fundamentally, education is a local function. The federal government, starting with that, the federal government has a kind of limited role. They give some money, approximately about 10% of the budget that goes to education comes from the national government. Used to be bigger, but not anymore. Special issue areas, like for example, there was No Child Left Behind, which was started in the second Bush administration. And the whole idea there was that the national government had this idea, and usually the national government has some big idea that it's going to change education or whatever the policy is. But here we'll just focus on education. They're going to change the policy so that it becomes improved. From day one, public education has been criticized as being ineffective. And boy, if you want ineffective, you should come to New Mexico and see how it is here. But that's for another time. Let me just say that so they picked something like No Child Left Behind, and essentially what that was they were going to improve education by having standardized tests for children and standardized tests for teachers. That was it in a nutshell, and that was going to improve education. So, it comes along, things like that come along all the time at the federal level. Practically every president has some idea of how he's going to reform the educational system. And that was the last one, No Child Left Behind. Bush did it, and then Obama had a version of it. And so far, we haven't heard much about it from Trump, but anyway, we probably will. Most of it would be just some kind of conservative approach, but he hasn't spent any time on it. But it might happen. Protecting the rights of minorities, gays, women, so on. The federal government does that. Teachers, protecting rights. I should say, minorities is a good example. And then the last one would be student loans, providing money that's go directly to students so that they can get loans so they can go to college. And in this day and age, that's a huge amount of money. Almost everybody, especially in graduate school, accumulates $500,000 or so in loans, which unless they get a really good job, they're not going to pay it back. Anyway, that's for another time. State is primarily involved in two things. One is funding. They fund about 50% of the expenses that go into education. A lot of times you'll see money directed from the lottery or national gambling, casinos and stuff like that going into education. But the state has to come up with it approximately somewhere in the neighborhood of about 50%. And then the other thing it does is standards. It sets standards for curriculum. It sets standards for teachers, all that kind of stuff. Here in New Mexico, we had a big controversy about science education. There was a commission at the state level that was going to change the standard of education and put in the Bible, or whatever they call it. I can't think of what you call it right now. But anyway, to teach the Bible rather than evolution. And it created such a stir that it never happened. But anyway, that's the kind of thing they'll do. They'll have these commissions that will say, how can we improve math scores or science scores or whatever. Um, anyway, that's the kind of thing they do. And then the local government is involved with everything else. This local school district is really primarily responsible. In some places like Chicago, it's the city government, but in most places it's a special district called a school district. We'll talk more about that much later in the class. But anyway, local government has the prime responsibility for education. So they do things like hire the teachers, build the buildings, carry out the curriculum, um, design some curriculum too, staff the schools, and carry out state and national mandates. Because like I said, like with No Child Left Behind, that's a federal mandate, and it's up to the local governments to see to it that tests are developed and administered and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, it's limited role by the federal government, a limited role by the state, and a primary role by the local government. So that's how I would answer that question. Number two is criticisms of federalism. Well, there's quite a few of them. Let me just go through some here. One is that they prevent national policy. So it allows local officials to frustrate policy. So let me give you an example. But you almost have, because of federalism sets up a national government, state government, and now it's recognized local government as separate entities, all participating in the making of policy. We'll talk a little more about that in another question, but essentially they're all involved. And if they're all involved, they all are going to have some influence. And the national government really boils down to is they can't police state and local governments. So you just don't know if they're really doing what the national government wants them to do or not. I mean, back in the day, back in the 1970s, for example, you had limitations on speed limits. That everybody had to go 55 miles an hour. That was the national speed limit. They since changed that, and in places where it's rural, not a lot of traffic, you increase it. States like New Mexico, where it's a lot of open road. God, I went to Clovis to get my dogs when I rescued them because they came from Texas, and I swear to God, I drove for like 2.5 hours, and I never saw a car on the road. I mean, it's incredible how few people there are. Anyway, that would never happen in Illinois. But so they've changed it. Now the speed limits here in rural areas are 75. So it's 75, 65 in some areas, and then on expressways in Albuquerque, it's 55, 65 and 55. So, the closer you get to the city, the more traffic you have, the more it goes down. So that's the national picture now. But in the old days, everybody was doing 55. Well, that was what they put up. That was the signs. You could go anywhere. In the 1970s, when we had the energy crisis where the Arabs weren't selling us oil, so we're going to save oil by everybody driving 55. So they put up these signs anyway that everybody's going to be going 55, and then you just saw 55 mile an hour speed limits wherever you went. But that didn't mean they enforced it. That didn't mean it really happened. That's up to state police and local police to enforce those rules. And in places like here, I bet they never did it. I wasn't here at the time, but I bet they never did it because they just don't have to. For one thing, we don't have the kind of patrolling of the streets like you do in Illinois. There just isn't enough police for all that. So that's what they mean by preventing national policy or frustrating national policy, because the national government says you got to do certain thing and then they don't do it. Anyway, there's a lot of examples. I'll just leave it at that. It leads to a lack of accountability. People don't know who to blame. If you've got national leaders, state leaders, local leaders, all participating in the same process, who do you blame? Like for example, in education, when I just talked about that, we have a dismal record here of public education in terms of how well our students do on standardized testing. In grade school, high school, it's dismal. We rank like 49th, 48 in the whole United States. So, who do you blame? Do you blame the national government because they don't put enough money in? You blame the state because they don't put enough money in? Or do you blame the locals because they're not hiring good enough teachers and so on? It's hard to know. It's hard to know. In any policy area of federalism, it's hard to fix who's responsible. We like to say, the president's responsible or whatever, but in federalism, it's all mixed up because they're all sharing. It's also a complicated system, and therefore too difficult for the public to understand. People don't really understand federalism. I remember a number of times seeing that in presidential debates where instead of having the kind of traditional debate where the candidates are arguing with each other, you have the public asking questions, and it's more like a town hall meeting with the two candidates there. And a number of times people ask the presidential candidates, they ask them questions that they really don't have any control over, that the president doesn't control. They'll say, I'll do what I can to fix the problem of speed limits in your neighborhood, or see to it that you get lights on your street, or something that has absolutely nothing to do with the president, but they're just trying to make themselves look good. But it's clear when you see those town hall meetings that the public has no idea how this system works. So it really is difficult. It's hard to understand. Another thing is that it fosters state loyalties over national loyalties. So you have states and local governments even having loyalties that are not to the national government. I don't know how realistic that is. I think most people identify with the national government, but out here in the Southwest and in the South, that has been somewhat of a problem for some people. Too much diversity in the laws from state to state. Boy, that's really true. That there is all kinds of different laws that you can find. If you just look at any controversial laws like abortion, gay rights, or the right to die, all of those are really different across the whole United States. Liberal states will have liberal laws on abortion. Conservative states will have very conservative laws. And that diversity makes it sort of unfair for the citizens who may want to use the services that are, like older people wanting to have the right to get assisted suicide. The cost and benefits are uneven. That is, there seems to be in federalism very much disadvantage to the poor states. So if you don't have a lot of money, you don't get a lot of services. And maybe that's our problem, our biggest problem in New Mexico when it comes to education, and that is that we don't have the money to pay for good schools and amenities in the schools and an effort to keep the kids in school. Okay, number 3 is, how does federalism differ in theory and practice? Well, there's 2 components here. There's the theory, which is called dual federalism, and then there's cooperative federalism, which is the practice of federalism. And let me just explain those a little bit. Dual federalism means the federalism that you kind of find in the Constitution, what the Founding Fathers had in mind, and that is the national government will have certain functions that it will perform. It will essentially do foreign policy. It will essentially do some laws that are national in scope, the need for national laws, and then settling disputes between the states individuals in the states, so that you can go to court. Especially when the Constitution was developed, there was a lot of problems, state to state, state to the national government, where people were dissatisfied because they were promised all kinds of things, like, during the Revolutionary War, the volunteers had a right to go home if they wanted to, and President Washington spent a lot of time making promises to soldiers to keep them in the war. And then after the war was over, the government really didn't have any money, and so a lot of soldiers were angry because they were made promises and they never were fulfilled. So they saw it as a possibility that there would be uproar between the states and the national government. The national government would the states would try to secede or try in some ways to get their money. So that was one kind of problem. But anyway, they saw the courts as a way to kind of settle it without going to war. And then the last thing is cooperative federalism, where that's the practice. So everything is separated. That the in dual federalism, I should have finished it. In dual federalism, the national government has a very limited role. It's going to do these three things I mentioned. It's going to do foreign policy. It's going to do national laws, a few national laws that are absolutely necessary, and it's going to settle disputes. And then, on the other side of the coin, the states doesn't recognize local government, just the states in the Constitution. The states will do everything else. They'll take care of roads and policing and education and all the rest of the stuff. Well, the practice of federalism is what we call cooperative federalism. First of all, you see that there's a third component. It's not just the national government and the states. There's a third component, which is local government. And all three of them are independent players in every area that was once considered only a state responsibility, like education. So you have the national government involved, the state and government involved, and the local government involved. And you can do that with every issue, whether it's the police or roads or anything that was originally just supposed to be the responsibility of the state. So that's the two components. That's the practice, the theory and the practice. Then the last question is, why federalism? Why do we have it? And what function does it serve? We have it because this is a big country and it's very diversified. This last year, Jackie and I went to China, and we went to a city called Wuhan, which is in the middle of the state. It's called the Chicago of China because it's in the middle, like Chicago is, and it has lakes like Chicago does, and so on. So it's a big city, much bigger than the cities we have in the United States, and yet it's about the fifth or sixth largest city in China. And one of the things you see there, which kind of surprised me, was, it sounds dumb when you say it, I went to China and all I saw were Chinese. You didn't see much diversity. Here, if you go to a big city like Chicago, you see every kind of nationality possible walking down the street. Every kind of people in the world are in the United States and in almost every city. Black and white and Chinese and so on and so forth. They're all here. And when you have that kind of diversity, which is very different from, like, say, China or Japan, where everybody's really pretty similar, you need a government that's going to accommodate that. So we have three levels of government, particularly in the Constitution. You see national government and states, and we allow then for these places to be diverse. I mean, the Southwest is very, very different from the Midwest. I can account for that, living here for 5 years. This is a very different world here than it was in Chicago. It's very much more laid back. It's much kind of small town small town environment kind of thing. So you have to be able to accommodate the people here. They believe in their guns, that kind of stuff, and you have to accommodate that. And so, big cities like Chicago, you could maybe have some kind of gun laws, but you can't have them here. That wouldn't work. So what you mean. You have to allow for diversity. The second thing is helps to manage conflict. You know, when the Constitution was first formed, you had the states already there, and founding fathers were doing was trying to build up a stronger national government. But you couldn't replace the states with a national government. That would never work. So what this system of kind of compromising, so you have three levels, and they're all participating. All of that kind of thing helps to manage conflict. So if the state of New York doesn't like the policy on abortion that's in Alabama, they can have their own. They don't have to have a national policy that works for everybody, because if you tried to do that, you'd have nothing but trouble. Another thing is that disperses power, I should say. And what that means is that, the founding fathers were very worried about concentrated power. I'm sure if they saw the presidency today, they would have a heart attack. They wouldn't understand it. They would think, wow, that's a dictatorship. So what they wanted to do, and you find this in the Constitution, and you find it in the practice of federalism, is that they wanted to divide power up. They did it between the President, Congress, Supreme Court, and they did it between the national government, state government, and local government in federalism, so that nobody can kind of dominate. In some ways, it hasn't worked, but like I said with the presidency, but in other ways it has, because when I was saying one of the criticisms of federalism is that you don't have a national policy, that's exactly what the founders would have wanted. They would want to see the states being able to go their own way if the national government is doing things they don't like. And the same thing for which has developed over time for local government to do what they want. Now that hasn't worked out nearly as well as states going their own way, but anyway, that's for another discussion. Another thing is it increases political participation. All you got to do is look at how it works in the United States with how many elections we have. It seems like there's an election every month. There's national officials have to get elected, state officials have to get elected, and local officials, and that gives everybody an opportunity to participate. Also, it does, if you wanted to go beyond the act of voting and you want to participate in an interest group or something like that, you don't have to just go to Washington. You can do it at the local level, you can do it at the state level. And then the last one is that it supposedly improves efficiency. That is what they're arguing here, and I don't really buy this argument myself, but what they're saying is that if an issue is local, like going back to education, if it's local, the local officials know how to handle a problem better than the national officials would. They create a bigger bureaucracy at the national level or at the state level, and it's better to have problems being solved as local as possible. That's the argument. And that can happen in federalism. It can't happen in a centralized government where you just really only have one level of government, like in the Brits system. So those are what supposedly the functions that are served by federalism. I hope that helped.